This is probably going to be one of the most exciting episodes I did with Mark Erikson. I think it's going to be a great conversation. We're going to name drop some people, and we're going to talk about React versus Redux context. It's probably not something you thought of or knew about. Most people just went to React context and thought, hey, everything's going to be fine. But there's a lot more depth there.
I've covered the whole Redux versus context thing more times than I care to think about. And earlier this year, I wrote an extensive post called Why React Context is Not a State Management Tool and Why It Doesn't Replace Redux. And honestly, this wasn't even a you should use Redux post. This is a everyone is getting the terms of the discussion wrong. And I want to make sure people understand what these tools do post. I even have a whole TLDR up front.
Where's the TLDR? Is that TLDR? That's the longest TLDR I've seen.
I know. Honestly, the arguments about this are people don't understand what the tools do. They don't understand the potential use cases, and they don't understand the differences in behavior. So this was me attempting to write the definitive post that explains all of those things. Now, obviously, I'm biased. I would like people to use Redux a fair amount, but more than that, I want people to understand when they should even consider using one of these. This one actually got a lot of hits. In fact, if I were to go back to my traffic stats since the start of the year, this is probably my single most viewed post.
Weird, because it's also one of the most, from what I've heard, it's one of your most asked questions too.
You have no idea.
So let's take it away from this piece for a second and just talk about what's your experience as a library author to deal with this question. Probably almost every day getting asked this, my assumption.
That's why I've written some of these posts and why I keep probably 3/4 of the posts on my blog are in response to specific questions. Like I'll answer the same question on Reddit a dozen times. And I'm like, you know what? If I'm going to answer it this many times, I ought to just write a post so I can link the post rather than having to rewrite the exact same explanation over and over.
Why people have this issue in the first place? Taking it a step back even, what is the reason why people don't understand these things? Even from people I've seen that are using Redux in their applications, some people don't even have the dev tools, which is like mind-blowing to me that somebody wouldn't have the Redux dev tools when you're using Redux. Like you're losing half of the benefit right there.
Like I said, it's a combination of not never taking the time to truly understand what tools do, the strengths and weaknesses and trade-offs are, and what specific problems they were trying to solve. And now we're on to one of my favorite hobby courses, which is that before using any particular tool, you should take the time to understand why it was created, what problems it solves, what the trade-offs are, and choose a tool that makes the best sense for your own situation.
Yeah. So that's interesting because here's like a really interesting topic here. Dan arguably got popular because of Redux and the dev tools, not just Redux, but the dev tools because of the time travel debugging, which is funny because it's like the least used feature now, in my opinion. And so that's how he got put into godhood, essentially, which is the
Pretty
craziest thing. But he got propagated that high that even without him being on the Stack Overflow, like who's going to be the most influential, whatever, he got 11th and he wasn't even written in there. I even wrote him in myself, like when I was answering that poll. So I was one of those many people that propped him up to number 11 of the top 10.
I mean, like if you think about it, Dan only actively worked on Redux for 1 year, summer of 15 to summer of 16. So many people, like when they think of Redux, they still Dan Abramov first. Now, this is not a whine about like, oh, people should pay more attention to me or I should get Twitter followers. I'm just observing that when most people think Redux, they think Dan Abramov first, because that is reputation.
Yeah, and because he's like elevated to godhood, it makes people maybe think highly of Redux initially, like without even considering any of the benefits or reasons why you would use it. And that maybe that's why it's the case that you're all constantly getting this question, because Redux is still seen as something as part of React. You know, it used to be that if you had React, you're going to have Redux. And then now it's this whole thing that there's a big debate about it.
Yeah, again, this is a topic I've covered dozens of times, but what it really amounts to is Redux won the Flux wars. It eliminated all the other Flux libraries that came out in 2014, 15. It was clearly the superior implementation of a Flux architecture. It matched React's mindset a lot, mildly functional programming principles. It was designed to work with React. It did solve cases like prop drilling at a time when old context did not work well for that situation. And for all those reasons, people eagerly adopted it far more than Dan ever thought they would. And then it turned into everyone assuming that if you're using React, you have to use Redux. And then you had the second and the third generation of users who were using it because everyone told them they had to use it without having taken the time to understand why they might want to use it. And so it was jammed into many, many apps that never even needed it in the first place. And then you had other tools coming along, Context, Apollo, React Query, whatever, that solved similar use cases. You had people who were stuck with Redux code bases that really didn't need it in the first place. You had people who had been forced to use sagas and observables and were like, I can't follow anything. And you had the whole backlash thing going on. So it's like the every 2 or 3 months on Twitter, like, I hate Redux. Redux is dead. Why does anybody use Redux?
Yeah, there's a lot of boilerplate that was also involved. This is pre-Redux tool.
Boilerplate.
There's
Yeah.
tons of boilerplate. People, and then the way that you were talking about before, the folder structure,
Yeah.
people are going to have to put things that made it difficult.
Every step along the way of kind of like the Redux journey, in a sense, has made sense if you look at what's going on in the ecosystem, what problems were people trying to solve, and how was this tool being used. I totally sympathize with the complaints. I sympathize with the backlash. I sympathize with, people saying they hate it. All those have good reasons. It's not like people are complaining about this in an unjustified way. But the flip side is Redux has also now acquired a reputation of being bad that we've basically fixed.
Yeah. From all the stuff I've seen with Redux Toolkit and RTK, which was the free system, and all of the different pieces of it, it's so much better now, and performance is improved, and it should be even getting better over time. React start getting put out, then that's actually the React connection, like not Redux in particular. Like Redux itself is not the changing piece; it's the React Redux connection. But yeah, it's like it's so much better than it was, and then yet people understood it in the first place.
The other thing, honestly, what really frustrates me more today than people complaining about it on Twitter is the fact that there's all these outdated tutorials out there. There's the ones that were written years ago, like Medium posts from 2017, but there's courses like on Udemy and other sites like that where it's like updated for 2021, and all they did was like slap 10 minutes of discussion on React hooks at the end, and it's still
Oh,
showing
no.
all our legacy Redux patterns in the middle.
Yeah.
Or there's even new tutorial posts that I see going up that still show all the same old Redux patterns. So we've been recommending Redux Toolkit for a couple years. I rewrote the docs tutorials last year. Like, a lot of people read our docs. Many more people don't.
Yeah, actually, the not reading the docs, but the main thing that I noticed when I was using Redux Toolkit is that there wasn't like anything in documentation at the time. I was, yes, on the website, there was tons, but in terms of other articles and things that you would expect to see, it didn't have the big pickup for some reason. I couldn't figure out like what are ways people are using this? How have people applied it? How did it work for them? Couldn't find those articles.
I have seen more third-party posts about using Redux Toolkit in the last year or so, although they're still mostly at the level of setting up a beginner application kind of
Oh,
thing,
yeah,
that
that's
that
way too
necessarily like
basic.
deep dives. But it frustrates me. I can't change any of the existing material out there, but I do wish people would actually look at our current recommendations and rate. If you're going to write a brand new tutorial from scratch, please at least use our current recommendations, because people look at these and they get misled.
You can't copy paste though, right? You can't copy paste somebody else's article into your article if you're following the doc.
That's its own separate topic, isn't it?
So it sounds like the main reason is that it started out a certain way. Most of the documentation out there is for the older way, and then the things that have been fixed and changed over time are now documented, but the thing is most people aren't now checking back.
Exactly.
Even people like me who have been using Redux since 2015, I'm not going to go back to the Redux site because I have everything memorized, or I did have everything memorized until you've completely changed it. Anytime I go back to it now, it's like completely different.
Yeah, like I'm like, and that's the thing. Like, all the Redux code that you learned 5 years ago still works. It still runs. You can still write code using those patterns. It's just that we figured out that, hey, here's a better way to do it, and now we're trying to teach that to everybody.
That's a big challenge. In fact, this is kind of like library author question here is like, how do you deal with that challenge? And now it sounds like you've been trying to get the word out. You're writing articles.
Mostly, I'd pop up in every social media thread and say, "Please see our new docs."
Oh my gosh.
I'm not even joking either.
Oh wow. I mean, isn't that a lot of work?
Yeah, it's kind of reflex by now. It's like I naturally read most of the stuff in the React subreddit anyway, or at least all the stuff that looks interesting. So like, I do that stuff naturally anyway. It's not like it necessarily takes like more time than I would have been spending, I guess.
Yeah, I hope not. It seems like it's a lot to propagate a new message when the old message is so hard ingrained. And like you were saying, if even new tutorials are coming out with the old way of doing things, then how are people supposed to learn? Because what they're going to do, they're never going to go to your doc site. If a lot of people go to a site, copy paste it out of there, and then they never touch it again. And so you got these old Stack Overflows, you got these old articles, you got all these things that are being pushed up because they have high view counts and they've generally done well, but now they're completely defunct for whatever Redux is.
Like I'm not like a necessarily like a deep philosophical person, but something I definitely kind of have absorbed over the last few years is that I can't make huge immediate change by myself. I can't change the entire inertia of an ecosystem immediately, and frankly, I can't change it. I can't change all of it anyway. All I can do is kind of chip away at it. So write another docs page, improve another tutorial, reply to another comment, add another API, fix another bug. And over time, it does add up. Like Redux, if you look at the download stats for Redux Toolkit, they have gone up almost like on a nicely straight angled line, increasing over the last 2 years. If you look at the response to using Redux Toolkit, they're almost universally positive. I routinely see people popping up in Reddit threads or Twitter comments telling other people how great Redux Toolkit is without me showing up and prompting them to do
That
that.
is very nice.
So that tells me that the efforts are paying off. But no, I can't force everyone to read our docs. I can't wave a magic wand and replace all the legacy Redux code out there. I can't magically replace all the tutorials. All I can do is just kind of keep chipping away at it over time and then try to nudge the ecosystem in a better direction.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing about all of this is that you're one of the maintainers, and like Dan has had nothing to do with this for quite some time.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be blunt, but in a polite way. Every single member of the React team that I can think of has at some multiple points made public statements about how much they don't like Redux, and especially Dan and Andrew. And that does frustrate me as the current maintainer. It's one thing if somebody else in the ecosystem says it. Now, there's still inevitably it attracts a wave of comments that I have to try to respond to and more FUD going around the ecosystem. But it's a different level when a React team member says it because they have the visibility and because they're so well respected. And in the case of Dan and Andrew, because they created Redux. And I don't want to try and tell them they can't have their own opinions. It's their Twitter account. They can say anything they want to. But at the same time, when you hit a certain audience size, you start having to be a little more cautious about what you say. And especially in this kind of a case, any negative comment they make about Redux will get amplified and has been amplified. And actually, I did slightly go off on Dan on this topic on Twitter about a couple months ago when he made a comment at the end of some tweet thread. Not in a mean way, I hope, but basically just saying, Dan, every time this happens, it really makes my job a whole lot more difficult.
I mean, understanding Dan's perspective too is that he's on
Mhm.
the React team and they're
Oh,
trying to make React easier to
right.
use and to get into, and you don't need
Mhm.
Redux and whatever. And like,
Absolutely. I totally understand their mindset. Like they've been working on React, they've been working on concurrent React, and Redux is now, in a way, an impediment to where they want to take the ecosystem.
yeah,
It functions fundamentally differently than how concurrent rendering and suspense work. And they're having to deal with that in a compatibility way. And it's a problem for them. And they're now approaching the problem from a different perspective. I totally get why they have concerns. They're not wrong in their concerns. Just that when they say that publicly, I end up with a wave of people saying how much they hate Redux.
that's crazy because to me, Redux was like, personally, Redux is what kicked off like, JavaScript, be able to take it off as a career and to be able to change the way I code and to improve the way I write things. And it all started with Redux. This one presentation from Dan, which I've even showed my wife, who really didn't care, but I've even showed it to her. I've showed it to a lot of people. This is like an inspiring talk about something that you can develop that completely changes the way you code things in a way that everything becomes easier to understand and easier to unit test and easier to manage and easier to identify like where things are coming from and debug it. And it's like it went from that and then now, yeah, the people say they hate it or all this stuff. What kind of environment are they working in where they hate it? Because that makes me wonder. I've never been in an environment where I hate Redux. I've been in an environment where, I want to improve Redux, but it's never the
Yep.
opposite.
So like Redux is well past its peak. I've been keeping kind of loose rough estimates of like market share for a long
Mhm.
time. Now a lot of that is based on like NPM download stats, which are a very imperfect proxy. And like, your random Twitter polls of like which state management tool are you using, which are even an even worse thing. Like we don't have hard objective numbers. So I just have to kind of try to guesstimate the best I can. And my own estimates have been roughly like it was like 55 to 60% of Redux app or React apps. And now it's maybe more like 45 to 50% maybe. So certainly I think that the relative market share has gone down, but the absolute download numbers continue to actually trend upward month over month. It's not like it's dropping. I still see lots of people actively using it as far as I could tell. So Yeah, it's very much alive. It just never will be as popular as it once was. There's still a huge number of people using it. There's lots of code bases that will be around for a very long time. And so I'm just trying to do everything I can to support existing users, to support new users, to make it easier to learn, easier to use, and try to be very, very clear. Here's when you might want to consider using it or not.
And one of the other things I'll add in is that my use case for Redux is typically when I want State Manager, but I don't have React. That's actually probably used Redux more without and with even without state before. I would build my own mini Redux at that point, but I've used it in Lua, I've used it on IoT devices, different things where I got to keep track of state and figure out how these events are happening and it connected, and then I got to do this and do that. All of these situations, I probably use Redux more without React than with React.
Redux teaches you some very powerful ways of thinking. I remember in maybe like 2017-ish, after I'd been working with it for a couple of years, we had a backend Python service that had a whole bunch of mutable internal cache structures. And I had to end up going in and putting some lock statements around all accesses to those because we were running into some threading issues. And it occurred to me, if I treated the internals of this in an immutable update approach, almost like a reducer style kind of a thing, I wouldn't have to worry about putting locks around this data because the data structure would never change. And you just assume that the copy you've got is fine. It's not going to get mutated under you. I never got around to making those changes, but like the fact that I now had that tool that I could use to envision solving problems really changed how I thought about a lot of things.
So I actually have developed something. Well, I didn't develop it, but I came up with a plan for how to do that with Angular JS, but to leave the Angular mutable state. So don't change that, but you do dispatch an action, and in the action, it will then do the VM dot whatever to mutate the state. But my sister actually implemented that where she worked before.
Oh, wow.
And so she converted all the controllers to use a Redux style of doing it, but still keeping the Angular mute.
Yeah, the project I've been on for the last year and a half, I took over a classic original mean stack app, including Angular 1. It was the first time I'd ever had to work with Angular anything.
That was Angular JS.
Yeah,
It is
yeah,
Angular
yeah.
1. Yeah, yeah.
In fact, the first thing I did when I joined the team, like the first 2 weeks, it's like, okay, I don't know what most of this code base does, but I see that you basically have no build system. All you're doing is running it through Babel, and that's barely it. There's no bundling. There's nothing. Can't even use NPM libraries in the front end. I'm going to redo the build system. And I ended up repurposing Create React app to build the Angular JS 1 client.
So I've done this before, but I had to roll my own Webpack. You did it with Create React app.
Yes, and I wrote a blog post about it. So I use CRA. I use one of the override tools, I think in this case,
okay.
Krakow. And so then I just hacked the guts of the Webpack config to find all the JS files everywhere, not just like source/index. Yep. Just threw all them in as entry points, import all of the HTML templates into Webpack and insert them into Angular's template loader system, a whole bunch of other stuff like that. And that allowed us, it fixed the bundling. We now had a reasonable bundle that only had a few files being loaded. It cut down on the number of requests, and it unlocked the ability to start inserting React and TypeScript code in the middle of the legacy Angular client incrementally.
So this is what I had to do is I added store.dispatch into the Angular router and into a bunch of other things so that I could control that from Redux.
The funny thing is, I actually deliberately resisted adding Redux to this app for a very long time.
That's the funniest thing to hear from you.
Well, no, like on it, like there were a couple reasons. It's an internal dashboard app. It's not very fancy, and it's basically like every page just fetches its own data. And so, like even when we started moving more of it to React, like I didn't see a justification bringing in Redux. The long-term migration plan is I set up a Next.js subproject, and I'm deploying both the existing Express app and the Next app side by side. The Next app is really just serving a new client, and then I'm using iframes in the old Angular proxied through Express to hit the next client page. And so from the user perspective, it's all just one page. Actually, the entire 90% of the body is an iframe that's loading a next app. So we got it stood up, proof of concepted, and then we built a new feature on top of that. And then we've been working on now progressively migrating like one page at a time over to the new Next code base. When we built this new first feature, it's a spreadsheet-like editing UI for a bunch of tabular data. And I actually set it up. I did pull in Redux Toolkit, but I made the reducer only for use with the use hook. I needed a complex reducer. I wanted it well-typed in TypeScript, but I didn't want to pull in a Redux store for this one page. So it's a slice reducer that's just straight to use reducer.
Oh, well, you just blew my mind. Oh my goodness. You can use Redux Toolkit.
Reducer
Oh my
functions.
gosh. So you used Redux Toolkit on use reducer, the official use reducer hook in React. That's incredible. What a cool idea.
A reducer function is literally just a function. It doesn't matter how you implemented it inside.
That's a interesting takeaway that I've never considered. But yeah, I do use reducers like that. I have used them in the past, but I never thought to use Redux Toolkit for something that's not Redux. Almost at that point, it should be renamed.
Yeah, pulled in Redux Toolkit just for create slice, but it's all the state is a single use reducer in the root component of the next page. And it works fairly well. Frankly, we're really just prop drilling to like the callbacks and stuff. Set that after that we migrated Angular is a fairly complex dashboard. I did go ahead and set that up with a Redux store for the visibility into the data. And we're actually looking at kind of going back and retrofitting some of that previous feature as part of the next step of the migration. Probably going to convert that use reducer hook into a Redux store because of some of the visibility.
This is a prime use case for Redux where you have two separate applications that need to share a state.
In this case, they're not even sharing the state. Like the Angular code is staying as it is. I actually have done some very, very funky back and forth. Like there was one page in the old Angular app where I embedded a form written in React that needed to apply updates to a nested field in the parent object. Like the outer Angular form update the parent object. This form is like applying updates to just one array. The React form gets the array as a prop passed down from Angular, and then it copies it into a use reducer. It applies immutable updates to the use reducer, but the Angular world expects a mutation to the parent.
Yeah.
So I have a use layout effect where I have very carefully commented, never ever do this at home, kids, mutating the parent object that I got as a prop.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's like you're not supposed to touch that stuff. It's like now you got side effects in a React component.
This goes back to the whole like knowing the rules and knowing when you can break the rules.
Yes, exactly. Like in React, people would say you should never, ever, ever mutate any of the props coming in because it causes a whole slew of other issues. But in this case, you have to do it because it's not React that's rendering this, it's Angular JS.
So I've got some very hacky back and forth interop between React land and Angular land in that legacy base. And it works. It actually works very well. And then the long-term migration plan is now that we have the next app stood up, we're basically just picking a page at a time, rebuilding it from scratch over in Nextland and iframing it into the old app. And then once every page is completed, then we can swap out the outer shell that has like your standard bootstrap nav header bar, the page routing, and the other stuff. And then the next client is the only client.
Yeah, that's interesting. You guys did yours a little bit different from me, but because you're iframing, you don't even have to worry about the existence of the Angular app. Because the way I did it, I was rendering the Angular app from a React app that I wrapped the whole Angular app in. So it was a little bit of a different approach. And it worked for us, but it was a little bit tough because then certain routes it would have to hide. You can't de-render. It would hide the Angular stuff and the Angular wouldn't do anything on those routes. And then when it comes, so that would display React app, right? And then it would come back to the Angular app if you went to an Angular specific route. There's a lot of kind of weird stuff. Yeah, but it's interesting to see different solutions to the same problem that both use Redux.
Well, in this case, the Redux bit is only ever coming into play in the newly rewritten dashboards piece that we did. All the work so far has actually not involved Redux. Like I said, I avoided bringing it in partly because I didn't think that the behavior justified it. In a way, I was almost like trying to prove a point to myself. Like I'm the maintainer, but I don't have to shove it into every app that I work on. But now the behavior and the logic really does justify having it in there.
Yeah, it's interesting to see it. Like you get to that conclusion. But yeah, I know how you feel about not thinking you have to use something. I've been like that too. I've like tried to, I've seen like how far I could take React context. And every time I do it, I find tons of issues and like, oh, how do you get performance here? Oh, well, if you just never update the context, you won't ever have a performance problem. Then now you have to use refs all over the place and do mutations on your refs in all over the place in your components. And it's like, is this better? Should I just have used Redux or Reducer or something else? You know, like those thoughts start running through my head at that point. Yeah. So I really appreciate your time that you spent. And
this has been fun. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Somebody else can talk the talk on Redux with me. Is like, we can get really deep. It's nice. And obviously, because you're the maintainer, you would know more. But typically when I'm in these situations, I'm not with somebody that has either used it as extensively or understands it as deeply as I do, which is kind of weird, honestly. honestly. So it's to be able to talk to you and have gone through all these things. I'll let you have the final say here, and I definitely want to thank you for your time.
I mean, I guess that the sum up is in my as usual has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. The core technology is still the same, but we've completely changed how we teach it, how we recommend people use Redux. We've got newer things like Redux Toolkit overall and Redux Toolkit Query. Got the React Redux Hooks API, and you're still rating Redux. You're just rating way less code to do it. And we've got a lot more things built in for the typical things people do with Redux. And down the road, we're working on React Redux version 8. We're going to keep things, make sure that they work reasonably well with React. And hopefully, based on everything I see, the public API for React Redux version 8 should stay identical in terms of like connect and use selector. Hopefully all the changes should be just on the inside. Redux is not dead. Lots of people still using it, and a lot of people giving us very, very positive feedback about improvements we've made over the last few years.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for watching this episode on React versus Redux context. I hope you had a great time and learned a bunch. I think I learned a ton from this conversation. In fact, I learned a ton from just talking to Mark Erikson in general. He knew a bunch of extra details that I didn't have, and that helped bring me up to the next level. So I'm hoping you guys could benefit from that as well.